Hello, everyone. Dr. Nikhil Verma here with another edition of Things I Didn't Learn in Med School. Today, I want to talk about something that comes up in my practice just about every week. Almost every patient, I have this recurring conversation. And I want to preface it all with this Latin term that came up during my research: Restitutio in integrum, or restoration to the original condition. We hear this buzzword of inflammation quite frequently. And we talk about inflammation in such a way that it's this very, very bad thing. I want to say that there is pain related with inflammation, and pain can be disturbing and likely bad for a lot of people. But the inflammation itself is not necessarily bad. And we, as a medical society, as society in general, are quick to go grab non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications like ibuprofen, Advil, naproxen, et cetera, et cetera. These are medications that we quickly go grab when we have painful joints, back pain, neck pain, tendonitis, tendinopathy, what have you. I want everyone to kind of think about this and start thinking about inflammation in a different way. So, this first article I'm bringing up, inflammation, the causes of all disease. As you can see here, inflammation is a biological process that serves as the body's first line of defense against harmful stimuli, pathogens, damaged cells, and irritants. Acute inflammation is crucial for healing and recovery. Chronic inflammation can lead to a variety of health diseases, including cancer, cardiovascular disorders, autoimmune conditions, metabolic conditions, and potentially worsening of chronic pain. And we'll go into that in a little bit here. If you go back to my last week's episode where I talk about the thymus and how the thymus involutes, it kind of shrinks and isn't allowed to process the way it likes to. One of the main functions, or the main function of the thymus, is to give us immunological modulators for the body to help us heal, recover, stave off infection, and likely staving off chronic disease. If you go back and I talked about the lymphocyte to monocyte ratios and how that ratio, when is lowered, actually leads to worsening of these chronic disorders. So when we use corticosteroids, the thymus actually involutes as well. When we have chronic disease, the thymus involutes, as well as now I'm starting to believe when we use chronic non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications, it also involutes. So this is kind of point one. I want to start bringing to people's attention of how quickly reaching for these non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications is not necessarily the best thing that we can do for ourselves and our bodies. This goes on and talks about how we recognize inflammation, and how the body responds to it. But if you can see on the second half of this arrow diagram, talks about adopting a healthy diet, increase physical activity, not just physical therapy, but all types of physical activity, adequate sleep, managing stress. There's enough studies to show that meditation in itself can decrease painful inflammatory markers in the body, and just to achieve active, healthier lifestyle. And I think that's kind of the MO of what a lot of these social media influencers or these biohackers are missing the point of. There's a lot of low hanging fruit for us all to make our lives a little bit better, but we want to reach for the quick fixes. This goes on and talks about how chronic inflammation leading to diseases. It's a really good article. I recommend people looking through it and understanding a little how this kind of works. So this brings me to the next journal of International Journal of Molecular Sciences. What is inflammation and what it's not? And this talks about my point exactly. The precise definition of inflammation matters for several reasons, not least because of the over liberal use of anti inflammatory drugs to inhibit inflammation, which may, contrary to prevailing dogma that all inflammation is harmful, acts counterproductively to prevent the restitutio ad integrum. So, what does this mean to us? I'm going to give an example of myself. And I know this is anecdote, but this is kind of my philosophy and what I believe in. When I decided to join a pickup basketball league 4 or 5 years ago, I was really excited. And very quickly, I think it was the second, maybe the third game, I rolled my ankle and I rolled it really bad. Very, very close to having to go on crutches and stuff. Uh, For myself, because of this literature and the data that I know, I decided to not take any non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications. I did physical therapy. I did home exercise therapies. I tried not to use ice. Ice can also dampen the inflammatory response. I tried not to use anything topical that had anti-inflammatory medications. I would use topical rubs and creams to help calm down pain, but not the inflammatory portion. And I tried to just let my body do its course. So I did have to take it, I think, one night, and maybe the next day. I don't recall, but I remember I didn't even have the bottle at my house. I had to ask a friend for a few of the pills. So it took me about a little bit over 6 to 8 weeks to get to being able to run on it again comfortably, and then after about 6 months to a year, I have no pain. I have no issues with my ankle. Now, I think if I would have taken the anti-inflammatory medications every day and tried to calm down the pain, I think that healing in that tissue would be different, and I'm gonna show that article what I mean here in a second. So I think it's important for us to realize that what's going on, that inflammation is not the problem. Pain is also a signal, and inflammation and pain come together, but we need to start looking at it in a little bit different lens. So this is kind of what I was talking about with my own journey, but what people need to start talking about or thinking about is if we have that initial phase reaction of inflammation from painful stimuli or whatever happens, we peak after about a few days. Usually about 24, 48, 72 hours is the peak worst portion of the pain. Now, if you start relying heavily on medications, then we never get out of this chronic inflammatory state. And this actually changes the cell types and the tissue around that area. And that can cause chronic lasting pain. You get fibrosis, you get guarding, meaning you can't move the muscles, you can't move your joints the same way. And it causes a whole other set of problems down the road. Does this lead to more of those cardiovascular, metabolic, immunological diseases in this chronic disease state that we're in America? If we are living in a time that is the unhealthiest and with the most chronic diseases, it's not too far outreach to start looking at this as a reason why that's happening. This chronic inflammatory state that we're putting our bodies through. If you can see that acute inflammation phase kind of comes down if you don't force yourself into chronic steroid use, chronic non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medication use. Yeah, so it's just kind of something to think about. The failure of resolution results in prolonged chronic inflammation with tissue remodeling, fibrosis, and disease. This is another great article. It goes really, really into the details about how what the cell damage does and how it responds, examples of anti-inflammatory medications, immunosuppressions, immunomodulations, et cetera, et cetera. So good article again, something to look over and something that I kind of believe. So here's my next point of it all is can chronic use of anti-inflammatory agents paradoxically promote chronic inflammation through compensatory host response? And as you can see, what I highlighted, by downregulating inflammatory pathways in a pulse-style fashion, chronic use of NSAIDs may promote compensatory upregulation of these same pathways and shift host-based equilibrium towards an inflammatory state. The host may be susceptible to inflammation between intermittent doses and after withdrawal of therapy. Inflammation is a promoter of anerugenia and thrombosis, and the constellation of these effects may predispose to excess risk of acute cardiovascular events. So I do want to highlight this. The host may be susceptible to inflammation between intermittent doses and after withdrawal therapy, meaning if you're relying on these medications, then you come off of it, you may have a rebound pain. We see that with rebound headaches all the time when people chronically use nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory medications. It's been documented. I have a theory and a belief that this also happens for people that take it for musculoskeletal disorders chronically. The last point I want to make about all this is recognizing the risk of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications in older adults. Now, I believe that this happens at all ages, and just because study was done in older individuals, I think it's very, very pertinent that we discuss because the more chronic NSAID use can exacerbate a number of chronic diseases, such as heart failure and hypertension, if you already have these diseases. I also believe that they work on neurodegenerative diseases, similarly, chronic vascular diseases, dementia, et cetera, et cetera. But we know that non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications will cause increased risk of peptic ulcer disease, gastritis, other GI disturbances, can cause acute and chronic renal failure, and cause chronic kidney disease. It can also increase your risk of stroke and myocardial infarctions. So these are not innate medications. And they did show that this was kind of dose dependent if you're taking for long-term chronic use. So if you're talking about you just got in a car accident, you roll your ankle, and you want to take a low dose for a few days, 3 days is usually what I recommend. I completely understand. I think that's fine. I'm talking of the whole continuum of relying on these medications as your sole crutch to feeling better. I'm going to talk a lot more about this in the years to come. I have some ideas of how I'm going to express this on my platform and other platforms out there. But this is kind of the base level I want people to start understanding. And I hope that you take this to heart and you take this to a loved one and share this video with someone that might be using chronic non-steroidal anti-inflammatory use. On my website and my Substack, I talk a lot about other alternatives to chronic NSAID use, so we can start talking about this in a different way. If you're a physician, I hope this was eye-opening for you and you see what's going on and why this could be causing more harm than good in the long run. Yeah, so that's mainly what I have for everyone. I hope you guys found this interesting or useful. I hope that you will share it with somebody. Please like, subscribe, drop me some comments, ask me some questions, send me a DM if you'd like, and we'll just have a better conversation and see how things go. And yeah, we'll talk to you next time. Take care. Bye.